Hi, SimPilot Andrew here, and if you're new to the channel and want to see flight sim hardware and software product reviews, or you just enjoy flying to anywhere, start now by subscribing and clicking on the bell icon below. Let's go flying. Welcome to the flight for today. We're parked in a 737 at Calgary International Airport, and I'm going to take the opportunity today to walk you through my new 737 setup. So in terms of software, I'm running X-Plane 11 on the main screens, the main simulator. I'm running two independent screens attached to the same computer running ZHSI, which is a plugin for X-Plane, which allows me to show the instruments on externalized monitors. I'm using Air Manager and externalizing the electronic flight bag in the screen on the right hand side here on a little iPad, which functions great. I'm also running software to drive the MCP and the EFIS for CP Flight as a plugin, along with the radios and the navigation radios. Navigation radios for navigating obviously on the ILSs, communication radios, an ADF, and also a transponder. I'm also running software that's driving the CDU from Cockpit Master, a company out of China that makes a really good CDU, which runs the flight management computer. And then the new addition to my cockpit is a new overhead panel, which is a one-to-one replica of the real thing. It's made by a company called simonsolution.eu out of Poland. And it works pretty much like the real thing. A bit of disclaimer, I am not a 737 pilot. This is for recreational, educational purposes only. I have my private pilot's license, but I'm not type rated in the 737. So this is just for fun. This is a hobby. So sit tight and we'll get started. Okay, let's get started. So the first thing you need to do when starting a 737, we're in a cold and dark cockpit. We're actually going to turn the battery on. So the battery is accessed through the overhead panel, and it's this switch right here. And you'll notice everything starts to come alive. The overhead panel has completely integrated into X-Plane 11 and functions, as I said, like the real panel in the real aircraft. So now that we have the battery on and we're actually parked at the gate, I'm actually going to turn on the GPU, the ground power unit, and also set the chocks. So I do that through the electronic flight bag. And when I do that, you'll notice that the ground power available light comes on the overhead. So we're going to select on to turn that on, and now the aircraft is actually using the ground power available to the aircraft. I'm going to turn the lights on the equipment, the MCP, and the background lighting on the MCP plus the radios themselves. You can see that show up in the panel on the bottom right hand side of the screen. What I'm also going to do now is turn on the IRS to align the IRS so that the plane navigation system actually knows where we are. So I do that by turning the IRS knobs to nav. They briefly go to on DC, and then they come up saying align, which means they're now aligning the IRS using GPS navigation to determine the exact location of the aircraft. So while that's aligning, there's a few things that we can do. You'll notice that we're starting to get more instruments on the screen here. The recording actually has those instruments highlighted in the bottom right hand corner. You have your attitude indicator, your navigation display, various different backup instruments if those instruments fail. And then you also have engine instrumentation, and on the far right hand side I have all of the warning messages that will come up in the cockpit if there's an issue. The bottom right hand corner of that screen is also a flap indicator, which shows the positions of the flaps all the way from up at 0 all the way through down to 40 degrees on the right hand side. Other equipment that I'm using in this particular flight, I have a honeycomb yoke, which is very good. I also have a honeycomb Bravo throttle, which has been adjusted a little bit, where I've added in some oversized handles on the throttles for engine 1 and engine 2. I've also added in a flap lever on the right hand side that has detents and numbers for the various different flap positions. I've also added in some engine idle and fuel cutoff valves, which are used for starting and stopping the engine, so we'll be using those as part of the flight today when we start the engines. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to start to turn some other parts of the plane systems on, and we're going to start in the overhead panel in the top left hand corner. And typically the flow that you do when you're working on the overhead panel is starting in the top left, going down to the bottom across each one of the different towers of instruments. So starting with the left hand side, we are going to turn the yaw damper on. You'll notice that that yaw damper light comes off when you put that on. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to turn one of the engine fuel pumps on. You'll hear that spin up in the speakers. We're going to require fuel for the APU, so we're going to turn that fuel pump on. We'll turn the rest of them on before we start the other engines. Then we come down to cabin utility, turn that on. IFE passenger seat, we turn that on. That's power, that's AC power powering those systems. Coming down here, there's nothing we need to do here at this point, so we've got equipment cooling is in the normal position. The emergency exit lights, we're actually going to arm those, and we're going to turn on the no smoking sign. We're going to leave fuel because we haven't actually fueled for our trip yet until we put that fasten seat belt sign on once we've finished refueling. We're going to turn the window heat on, left and right, side and forward. And then we're also going to put on the electrical pumps for the hydraulics. You can hear that spin up. At this point in time, we're also going to turn the trim air on. We're going to turn the left and right recirculation fans on. The air conditioning fans to auto, and we're going to open the isolation valve. We're also going to turn on the bleed air so that when the engines are on, we're getting bleed air that's going to get fed into the engine. APU bleed air, will turn that on when we have the APU on. So now let's take a look at the flight plan. So now I have my flight plan created. I actually used SimBrief to create the flight plan. I have it here on my iPad. SimBrief is a tool on the web which is free to use, and it creates operational flight plans much the same way that an airline would use them in the real aircraft. So what we're interested in on this flight plan is the fuel and the weather and various other pieces of information that this flight plan will give us. So today we're in Calgary, we're going to be flying to Vancouver, so the flight plan has already calculated how much block fuel that I need. So it's saying I need 14.7 thousand pounds of fuel, so that's 14,700 pounds of fuel, which I don't quite have that in the fuel tanks right now, so I'm actually going to type that number. I'm going to probably make it 15,000 pounds in my EFB and call the fuel truck.
Ground flight deck hose is connected and starting refueling.
So while that's refueling, we're also now going to add the payload in terms of number of passengers. So in this case, we have 155 passengers. So I'll put that in the payload. And then start a flight leg.
Ground to flight deck, fuel is all loaded up and you are good to go.
So now I've got fuel. I've fueled up to 15,000 pounds, and now I'm going to put the seatbelt signs on.
Ladies and gentlemen, you'll see the seatbelt lights flash on and off. It's also an indication for you to actually make sure that your seatbelt is securely fastened and ready for departure.
So now while we have passengers loading onto the plane, we're actually going to set up the flight management computer. So the first step is for us to actually tell the computer where we are. So we actually grab the GPS location from the IRS and set the IRS position. And you'll notice that now the IRS is aligned. I'm starting to get a complete picture of instruments. So I'm in Charlie, Yankee, Yankee, Charlie. That is my origin airport, and I'm flying to Charlie, Yankee, Victor, Romeo, which is Vancouver. We are WestJet flight 111. And now we're going to start entering in the route we're going to be taking, flying between Calgary and Vancouver. So from a departure perspective, we're going to be departing on the Calgary 7 departure, and looking at the flight plan, we are leaving on runway 29. So now from there, I know this route pretty well since I've flown it a number of times, so I'm just going to enter in the first waypoint after our vector from air traffic control once we take off is BOTAG, then to Booth, and then back to the departure and arrivals page. We're actually going to be landing on ILS runway 13. Actually, in this case, let's go with 8 right. And we're going to take the Canuck 5.
Please activate your full attention. This is for your safety and for the safety of the passengers around you. Thank you very much.
So you can see in our flight plan, we're flying now from BOTAG to Booth to Vitev, Stave, and then the approach procedure into 08 right.
On board this Ryanair flight. May we have your attention while we point out some of the safety features on this Boeing 737-800 aircraft. Please remove headphones during this demonstration. There are 8 emergency exits, each marked with a red exit sign. Tour-path markings along the cabin aisle will illuminate in darkness and guide you to the nearest exit in an emergency. There are 4 main doors, 2 at the front of the cabin, 1 left and 1 right.
So now we have fuel and we have the passengers on board. We move on to doing the performance initialization on the flight plan for this flight between Calgary and Vancouver. So we are 137,000 pounds. We have 15,000 pounds of fuel on board. When I look at my flight plan, if I look at the amount of reserves that I have left, it's 5.4, which I enter in. And the cost index, which is how fast or slow I'm going to burn the fuel, today is going to be 18. We're actually going to be cruising at an altitude of 320. I put that in the altitude, and I look at the top of climb winds in my flight plan, and it tells me it's 261 at 050. I put that in with an ISA deviation of +6. Moving on to the next page, I'll look at my outside air temperature. It's actually showing me here warm day today, 27 degrees in Calgary. And it'll show me the percentage of N1, which is the percentage of thrust, and it's 100.6. So I'm going to leave that as it is right now. That's at the full 26K. I'm going to be running 5 degrees of flaps. My center of gravity is 19.1%, which is calling for a trim setting of 5.5. So on the screen here, it shows me at the moment I'm set at 5. So I want to back that down to 5.5. It's also giving me the V speeds for takeoff. So V1, VR, V2. My V2 speed here is 143, so I'll enter that into the MCP up here in front. At this point, I'll also turn on the flight directors and arm the auto throttle. Now that the flight plan is entered, I can actually check the route that is programmed into the flight management computer by looking at the map and making sure I don't have any discontinuities between a takeoff and landing. So I turn the EFIS to plan mode, and then the FMC changes so that I can step through the flight plan on the screen. My first waypoint with vectors from air traffic control is BOTAG, then Booth, Stave, and then we're starting to get into the approach procedure for 8 right, and it takes you to Vinlo with then vectors based on air traffic control's direction to bubble down to 8 right. So that looks all good. So I switch that back to map mode, and I'm going to put on the terrain radar, and I'm also going to put on the airports. So on the navigation display, you can see here Calgary is a pretty mountainous area to the west. You can see that being painted in the radar on the screen. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on the rest of the fuel pumps, and I'm also going to turn on the APU. APU is an engine that sits at the back of the plane that allows me to be running power from the APU to help power all of the systems when I'm not connected to ground power. So the low pressure light comes on, and then the needle for the exhaust gas temperature coming out of the APU starts to rise, which tells me the engine is starting in the back of the plane. So we'll wait for that to go up, and it'll settle down. It'll come back down once it's stabilized. You notice the APU generator light came on. So what that allows me with left and right is to turn the APU generators on so that I'm now not reliant on the ground power. I can also turn on the APU bleed, which is going to assist me when I go to start the engines. So at this time I'll change this to 32,000, which is our cruising altitude. So this is for cabin pressurization. And my landing altitude, so that it knows how to pressurize the plane when I'm landing, is 100 feet, which is the destination altitude of the airport. It's about around 100 feet. I'll also change my altitude on the MCP to match. In the real world, you'll get staggered climbs up to 32,000, but for now, we'll just leave it at 32,000. So now I have the APU on. I can actually turn off the ground services that I had attached. So I had the GPU, and also I'm going to remove the chocks. So now we're running completely disconnected from the ground, and we can actually request a pushback. X-Plane 11 has a excellent pushback facility through a plugin called Better Pushback. So what it allows you to do is call for a tug.
Ground to Cockpit, please show me where you want to go.
So now I've already pre-programmed this in, and we're going to accept what they said in the plan. Actually, let me just see if I can move this a little bit.
Ground to Cockpit, tow is driving up.
Here comes the tow. So in preparation for engine start, I'm actually going to turn the left and right packs off because it needs as much bleed air as it can get from the APU and as much power to be able to start the engine. So we'll leave those off for now, and we'll wait for the pushback.
Okay, all doors and hatches are closed, ready to connect.
So ordinarily, this is a two-pilot cockpit, and there's lots of activities the pilot flying, the pilot monitoring would be doing. They'd also be following a number of different checklists as part of this procedure, which we're not doing today. Obviously, would also be talking to air traffic control in terms of ground control, and then tower control for takeoff, which we won't be doing today either. But this is really just to give you an idea as to how all of the systems together work in this version of X-Plane 11. And I don't think I mentioned it before, but I'm using the Zibo Mod 737 for this setup.
So connected and bypass pin inserted. Release parking brake.
So I'm releasing my parking brake.
Starting pushback, and you may start engines.
What I'm also going to do now is just adjust the course for the airport runway heading for 29, which is 285. I'm also going to pre-arm VNAV and pre-arm heading select for the autopilot. So courses show the runway heading of 285 and the heading of 285 on the MCP. Now he said we were clear to start engine, so we're going to start engine number 2 first. So we turn the engine start knob to ground, and we notice down here on this screen N2 is rising. There is no fuel in the system right now. It's just essentially the APU powering the bleed air from the APU powering the spin up of the engine. Once that gets to 25%, I will then add fuel into the right engine number 2, and you'll notice here on the screen that N1 is now starting to spin up, and I'm getting a rising exhaust gas temperature in engine number 2. The engine start switch cuts off to off automatically, and if we look for stabilized engine, it's 246, so 20%, 460 on the exhaust gas temperature, and 60% N2, so 246 for stabilized engine. So that looks stabilized. We're now going to start engine number 1, turn that to ground, N2 is rising. You can hear the engine spinning up. N2 is at 25%. We add fuel. We have N1 spinning up. We have exhaust gas temperature from engine number 1. And our start cutoff has turned off. So 2, 4, 6, we have stabilized engines. So we have 2 engines started. So now that we have the engine started, which can actually switch it off of the APU to have the electrical powers and all of the systems being run from the engine power, I can turn the engine 1 and 2 on. I can now put my left pack to auto, my isolation valve to auto. APU bleed I don't need on anymore because we used it already. So I turn that off. I can actually turn my probe heat on. Now the engine is started. I put my engine start switches to continuous for takeoff. Then I can turn the APU off. You notice the APU gen light goes off on the overhead panel as well.
Operation complete. Set parking brake.
Setting parking brake.
Disconnecting tow. Stand by.
Now our tow is disconnecting. Bless you.
Tow is disconnected and bypass pin has been removed. Hand signal will be on the left. We'll see you next time. Have a safe flight.
And we'll just look to see our tug driver pull away and show us the pin on the left-hand side. Okay, there's the pin. Now we're good to taxi. So now getting ready for taxi. We'll put on the taxi lights, the runway turn off lights left and right, and we'll take our flaps down to 5 degrees. You'll notice that the flap indicator on the bottom right hand of the screen is starting to move. you'll see the leading edge flap indicator light comes on, showing that they're extended. And the flaps are now at 5 degrees as confirmed by the indicator. So now we'll take the parking brake off and let's taxi to runway 29er. On the ground, the 737 is actually controlled, you would think, by the rudders, but it's actually not. There's actually what's called a tiller on the left-hand side, and on some aircraft also on the right-hand side of the aircraft, which is used to turn the nose of the aircraft. And I'm using that to taxi. Good airmanship, sticking to the center line. Prior to our taxi, we would have talked to the ground controller, and the ground controller would have given us specific routing instructions on the ground, but we're not doing that today. But I do happen to know where this particular runway is on the airport location. So we are on Taxiway Hotel. We're taxiing towards the Taxiway Juliet. And we're gonna taxi left onto Juliet and then immediately right onto Gulf. Up here on the left we have Taxiway Foxtrot, which we'll turn left on. WestJet hangars on the left. Coming up on Foxtrot 1 and Foxtrot all the way to the end. We're just going to taxi up to the hold short line. And we're just going to put the parking brake on here. And as was taught to me when I was flying 172s, now it's time for lights, camera, action. So we're going to put the landing lights on, turn off the runway turn-off lights, turn off the taxi light. We're going to switch the position and strobe to flashing, and then we're going to turn the transponder to TARA. Well, we're ready to take off. From cold and dark all the way to the current runway for takeoff. I hope you've enjoyed the flight today. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comment section below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks very much. Have a good day.